I now call the Home Secretary Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll make a statement on the Southport murders. None of us will ever forget the events of 29th of July. The school holidays had just started. Little girls were at a dance class to have fun, to dance, to sing. A moment of joy turned into the darkest of nightmares. And we think especially of three little girls, Elsie Dot Stankham, B.B. King, and Alice de Silva Aguiar. Their precious smiles and the dreams that their families had. And we think of their families' agony to have that future so brutally destroyed. They are in all our hearts and prayers, as are those who survived the attack but who live with the physical and emotional scars. And nothing will ever take away their trauma and loss, and we will ensure that they receive the support and care they need in the years to come. We think too of the police and first responders who ran into that scene of unspeakable horror. The courage they showed and the lives they saved is public service at its very best. Yesterday, Axel Rudakubana pled guilty to all charges. He stands responsible for one of the most barbaric crimes in our country's history. The most vile and cowardly attack on little children who could never defend themselves, carried out in the most horrific and traumatic way. The CPS has described him as a young man with a sickening and sustained interest in death and violence, who has shown no sign of remorse. On Thursday before sentencing, the prosecution will set out what happened that day and the nature of those offences. But, Mr. Speaker, now that the conviction has been secured, the families, the people of Southport and the entire country need answers about how this horrendous attack could ever have happened. The government has been constrained in what we could say up to this point about Rudakubana's past to avoid prejudicing any jury trial in line with all the normal rules of our British justice systems, because nothing was more important than securing justice. But now we can start to lay out that background. Multiple different agencies were in contact with Rudakubana and knew about his history of violence. He was referred 3 times to Prevent between December 2019 and April 2021, when aged 13 and 14. Between October 2019 and May 2022, Lancashire Police responded to 5 calls from his home address about his behaviour. He was referred repeatedly to the multi-agency safeguarding hub. He had contact with Children's Social Care, the Early Help Service, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. He was convicted of a violent assault against another child at school and was referred to the Youth Offending Team. He was excluded from one school. He had long periods of absence from another. All those agencies had contact with him. Yet between them, they completely failed to identify the terrible danger that he posed. How did he fall through so many gaps? It is just unbearable to think that something more could and should have been done. So there are grave questions about how this network of agencies failed to identify and act on the risks. There were so many signs of how dangerous he had become, yet the action against him was far too weak. So families need the truth about why the system failed to tackle his violence for so many years. That is why we are setting up an independent public inquiry. Like the Angiolini inquiry into Wayne Couzens, it will begin work initially on a non-statutory basis so that it can move quickly into action, but with statutory powers added later as required. We will set out the terms of reference and appoint the chair once we have consulted the coroner and given the families the opportunity to comment. And in addition to examining what went wrong in this horrific case, I am also asking the inquiry to consider the wider challenge of rising youth violence and extremism. because I have been deeply disturbed at the number of cases involving teenagers drawn into extremism, serious violence and terrorism, including Islamist extremism, far-right extremism, mixed and confused ideology, and the obsession with violence and gore. There has been a threefold increase in under-18s investigated for involvement in terrorism in just 3 years. 162 people were referred to Prevent last year for concerns relating to school massacres. The Met Commissioner has warned about young men who are fixated on violence grazing across extremist and terrorist content online. And Five Eyes counter-terror partners have warned about growing radicalisation of minors, happening as so many of our children and teenagers are being exposed to ever more disturbing materials online, an online ecosystem that is radicalising our children while safety measures are whittled away. The Online Safety Act illegal content codes of practice come into force in March, and the child safety codes should be in place this summer. But companies should take responsibility before then. The prosecution will provide more detail on Thursday about material Rudakubana searched for online, but I can tell the House the government is this week contacting technology companies to ask them to remove dangerous material that he accessed. Companies should not be profiting from hosting content that puts children's lives at risk. And let me set out 4 other areas where we're taking action in advance of the inquiry. Firstly, on Prevent. The Government and Counter-Terrorism Policing jointly commissioned an immediate Prevent learning review during the summer, and I will publish detailed findings following the sentencing. The 3 referrals took place between 3 and 4 years before the Southport attack, including following evidence that he was expressing interest in school shootings, in the London Bridge attack, the IRA, MI5 and the Middle East. On each occasion, Rudakubana's case was assessed by Counter-Terrorism Policing, but in each case, there was no onward referral to specialist channel support. The learning review has concluded the referrals should not have been closed, and that cases such as these, given his age and complex needs, should be referred to channel. It concludes that too much weight was placed on the absence of ideology without considering the vulnerabilities to radicalisation or taking account of whether he was obsessed with massacre or extreme violence. And the cumulative significance of those 3 repeat referrals was not properly considered. Mr. Speaker, the Prevent programme is vital for our national security, and its officers work with huge dedication to keep us safe. But we need it to be effective. Some changes have already been made since 2021, including new Prevent duty guidance, new training for frontline workers on radicalisation, stronger policy on repeat referrals. And in September 2024, a new Prevent assessment framework was launched, supplemented by robust training for all Prevent police officers. But these changes do not go far enough. Given the importance of the programme, I cannot understand how it has been allowed to operate for so long without proper independent oversight. That is why I announced before Christmas the introduction of a new independent Prevent Commissioner with the power to review cases and to ensure that standards are being met. So I'm today appointing Lord David Anderson, KC, as an interim Prevent Commissioner to start work immediately, and his first task will be to conduct a thorough review of the Prevent history in this case to identify what changes are needed to make sure serious cases are not missed, particularly where there is mixed and unclear ideology. I've also tasked my department to conduct an end-to-end review of Prevent thresholds, including on Islamist extremism, where referrals have previously been too low. And we're looking at cases where mental ill health or neurodivergence is a factor and developing new arrangements with other agencies which may not meet the threshold for channel counter-extremism support, but where violent behaviour urgently must be addressed. Second, 2 shocking facts around knife crime emerged from this case. The Prevent Learning Review found that Rudakubana admitted to having carried a knife more than 10 times, yet the action against him was far too weak. And despite the fact that he'd been convicted for violence and was just 17, he was easily able to order a knife on Amazon. That's a total disgrace, and it must change. So we will bring in stronger measures to tackle knife sales online in the Crime and Policing Bill this spring. Mr. Speaker, thirdly, as the Prime Minister has set out this morning, we need to ensure our laws keep up with the changing violent and extremist threats we face. It is for the police and CPS to decide whether individual cases meet the definitions set out in the Terrorism Act 2000 when making charges. But given the growing number of cases where perpetrators are seeking to terrorise, even without a clear ideology, we need to ensure the law, powers and sentencing are strong enough to cope. I have therefore asked the independent reviewer on terrorism powers to examine the legislation in this area in the light of the modern threats we face. Finally, Mr. Speaker, let me address the issues of contempt of court. Because the British way of justice means information is presented to the court by the police and CPS with restrictions on what can be said beforehand, so the jury does not get partial or prejudicial information in advance to make sure that the trial is fair and justice is done. Social media puts those long-established rules under strain, especially where partial and inaccurate information appears online, and the Law Commission is reviewing the contempt of court rules in that light. But let me be clear, where the police, government and journalists are given clear advice from the CPS about contempt of court and about not publishing information in advance of a trial, if we did not respect that, and a killer walked free, we would never be forgiven. Mr. Speaker, there are times when something so unfathomably terrible happens that whatever words we find feel grossly insufficient. And that is how it feels over the Southport attack. So let there be no doubt. Responsibility for this outrage lies squarely with the perpetrator, but equally, in the wake of such a monstrous atrocity, we have to ask every question, no matter how difficult, and where change is needed, we must act. That is now our task. We owe that to the victims, to their loved ones, and we owe it to the country, because protecting the public is the first duty of the government and the shared purpose of this House. I commend this statement to the House.